you like to set up your laptop because or after I call or after each? All right. Yeah. All right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Magandang hapon po sa ating lahat. I am Sunny from SEARCA. Welcome to the Agriculture and Development Seminar Series brought to you by SEARCA and our knowledge partners, the UPLB College of Development Communication and the Philippine Partnership for Sustainable Agriculture. So ADSS, this seminar has been one of our platforms for facilitating exchanges of scientific and practical knowledge for agriculture and development. So this is primarily for our stakeholders within the Los Baños science community. That's why we have our stakeholders from UPLB and nearby scientific institutes. And we also have with us participants joining us remotely through Facebook. So this is also being live streamed through the SEARCA Facebook page. So if you're on Facebook right now, please don't forget to also share the live stream to your colleagues, send those to your messengers, to your chat groups, to your friends who may be interested to attend this seminar. So as I've mentioned, this is in partnership with the UPLB College of Development Communication and the Philippine Partnership for Sustainable Agriculture. We have our partners joining us later online. And for the last few weeks, we have been working together to bring you this seminar featuring our resource speaker from the UK and a set of our reactors from Carbon Farm, Grow Asia, and SEARCA. Okay, so are you all excited to hear from our resource speaker? Yes. Okay, wag na natin patagalin. So let me briefly introduce our main resource speaker. Dr. Dominic Glover is a research fellow from the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex, Brighton, United Kingdom. And currently, he is a visiting professor in the Department of Science Communication, College of Development Communication, UP Los Baños. He is an interdisciplinary social science researcher working at the intersection of international development studies, science and technology studies, international political economy, geography, and anthropology. His work focuses on knowledge systems, technology, innovation, and technological change in agriculture and food systems, with 2 decades of experience in research, teaching, policy analysis, and communication. So here to talk about a very interesting topic, Beyond Adoption, a Technographic Approach to Analyzing and Understanding Technological Change in Agriculture. Ladies and gentlemen, let us all welcome Dr. Dominic Glover.
Good afternoon, everyone. Great. So let me begin by thanking SEARCA for the invitation. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here and speak with you today. Thank you all for coming. I would very much like to appreciate also the colleagues who are here from the Department of Science Communications in the College of Development Communications for inviting me to be a visiting professor these past 3 weeks, and to everybody in the university who has welcomed me and facilitated my visit. I've really felt very much welcomed and cared for while I've been here. I've learned a lot. I think we've been working very hard together, and it's been very much appreciated on my side. So you'll notice that my title here is Beyond Adaptation, rather than what it says on the poster, Beyond Adoption. And my subtitle, A Technographic Approach to Analyzing and Understanding Technological Change in Agriculture. I will ask SEARCA to find some way to circulate these slides afterwards. And on the title slide, you'll see that this presentation is based on a number of publications over the last several years. So if you want to follow up, you'll be very welcome to do so. And if you want to get in touch as well, my contact details will be on the last slide. So what on earth do I mean when I say that I'm taking a technographic approach? Let me begin by talking about technography as a conceptual framework and a method. And approximately, you can think of technography as being an ethnography of technique or an ethnography of technology. In other words, it's a materialist, a realist, and an observational understanding of how technology really works in the real world. To put it another way, a professor who used to be my boss, Paul Richards, likes to say that we study technology, not innovation. And there's a lot of fixation, a lot of obsession with innovation. Some of it becomes rather meaningless in the end because almost anything you can do is an innovation, but people very rarely talk about the direction of innovation, and they also neglect all kinds of technologies which are mundane, humdrum, taken for granted, everyday kinds of technologies. So technography is an ethnography of technology or technique, and through a technographic lens, technology is viewed as a domain of technical practices in which tools and techniques are deployed purposefully to transform materials and thereby to achieve human and social objectives. In other words, I'm going to point out that technography is a branch of the social sciences, whereas technology is often thought of as being the domain of technocrats and the natural sciences. This technographic understanding of technology is associated with the ethnographic scholarship of social anthropologists such as Marcel Mauss, Francois Sigaud, and Paul Richards, my former boss, from whom I learned when I was a postdoc at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. And the Wageningen approach to technography is what I'm going to be talking about in this presentation, and it was summarized in a paper by my former colleagues Kees Janssen and Sietse Velleman, a paper in 2011, and they spelled out three components of a technography, which are shown here. So it's a study of making, which means studying techniques and material transformations and understanding the human purposes of those activities. And it's about making performed by individuals, so it's about technique, it's about bodily skills, it's about embodied knowledge, but it's also about the organization and coordination of tasks and task groups. And as an ethnographic technique or ethnographic methodology, it's based on observing how people actually use tools, how they coordinate activities. Secondly, it's about the distribution of information and power through the practicing of tasks, through the practicing of techniques and the organization of operations and tasks. Now, the exigencies of the task will sometimes entail a distribution of agency, a distribution of power, a distribution of information, and it's very often uneven, and that sometimes has consequences for who acquires power in the setting. And it's about the structure and coordination of tasks and task groups in time and space. For example, in the agricultural season, you'll have different jobs on the farm done by different people at different times, and the work that they do has a role within a whole sequence. So then somebody else turns up on another day to do a follow-up task or a companion task. And the making and the distribution of information and power has implications in terms of the construction of rules. That's to say protocols, routines, rituals, institutional rules, norms, and cultures. And it's associated very often with guilds, with trades unions, with professional associations, sometimes secret societies, cults, apprenticeship, and initiation ceremonies. So I'm not going to say anything more about the sort of theory of technography, but I would encourage you, if you wish, to read further about it. So to make that simpler, I'm going to offer this technographic concept of technology as a sort of working concept, that technology is not about things, it's not embodied in your smartphone, it's not something that exists outside of ourselves, independently of us, with its own kind of autonomy and its own independent identity, its own agency. It's actually about us. It's about our practices and our relationships. And when I say practices and relationships, I'm talking about, for example, tasks, techniques, routines, skills, and their associated knowledge, which is very often tacit knowledge, embodied knowledge. And I'm talking about relationships, which is to say connections, interactions, transmissions, flows, exchanges. And I want to emphasize here that I'm talking about both the relations among people and also relations between people and things, people and environments, people and tools, people and instruments. So in short, a technographer understands the term technology to mean not only technical systems, tools, artifacts, engines, machines, but also the techniques, practices, institutional cultures, and the forms of social organization that are involved with the deployment and the use of those systems, tools, machines, artifacts. In other words, this is a view of technology viewed through the skills and the agency of technological practitioners of all kinds. It's not about gadgets, devices, and machines. It's about practices and techniques and about relationships among people and between people and things. It's about purposeful action by individuals and groups, or tasks and task groups. It's about mobilizing and using knowledge, skills, tools, instruments of many kinds. In agriculture, that includes living organisms. It's about coordinated action, the assembly and choreography of resources in time and space. In other words, it's a social and a material phenomenon simultaneously. And I want to emphasize the last bullet point on this slide. People everywhere are technological practitioners. And why am I emphasizing that? Because once you've started to look at technology as practices and relationships, it becomes really quite mindless to think of technology as being an entity outside of ourselves, which, for example, has been developed and perfected in the laboratory, and then is being commercialized or disseminated or passed out across the walls of the research station into the hands of farmers. Because that's not how technology works. Technology is about practices. I'm going to talk about agriculture as technology. In other words, farming as a kind of technological practice, in which we can see farming as the use and coordination of a wide array of tools and resources, including living organisms and techniques, to build a livelihood from the land. It's enabled and constrained by the material world, so it's a realist and materialist approach to understanding agriculture, and it's also enabled and constrained by cultural routines. In other words, it's situated in a particular place and in a particular culture, a set of traditions and norms, and a set of relationships. And farmers are technological practitioners. That's to say, they are skilled actors, decision makers. They are socially and culturally embedded in a particular society, a particular community, a geography, a topography. They're located in space and situated in time as well. And I'm also going to make an important note here. When I say that farmers are skilled actors, I'm not making a romantic statement which simply says that farmers are innately wise or that their traditions are always perfect and wise and sustainable. What I'm saying is that they have skill, and that skill can be poor or it can be good. They'll have a level of skill. They could be incompetent. That's a level of skill. But if you want to be a successful farmer, you're going to need some skills involved in marshalling all of these resources and coordinating them in time and space. Now, what tools do we have to understand farmers as technological practitioners? One of them is the concept of performance. And again, I'm referring to the work of Paul Richards here, where Paul, among other things, is a musician. And he used the analogy for small-scale farmers of a musician performing alongside other musicians on a stage in a band. And the kinds of skills that a musician has to use in that circumstance are similar, he argued, and I think it's a convincing argument, to the skills of a farmer in a dynamic environment, especially if you consider that the other musicians in this performance are not only other farmers, but they are plants, they are livestock, they are soils, microorganisms, they are trees and fertilizers and so on. And one of the points I want to make here is that this is an analogy that I think works quite well for small-scale farmers, especially in marginal environments. There's a strong argument that it isn't really a relevant analogy for large-scale commercial industrial farmers in places like the grain belts of North America or the livestock and dairy producers of North America and South America, where The farms are much more like factories. There's much more sense in which people plan ahead. They have their spreadsheets, they have their budgeting, they manage the farm much more like a factory or like a business operation. But in the context of small-scale and contingent farming in marginal environments, that kind of planning is often out of reach, partly because the resources available are quite thin to do the managing, but partly because living in a marginal environment, you're often buffeted by unpredictable events. You don't know exactly when the rain is going to come. You don't know when there's going to be a shock in exchange prices or in the supply, or the bridge might be down, or whatever might happen. So we're not talking about a planned activity necessarily, but a skilled performance that unfolds in real time. And that's significant because it means that it places a premium on the farmer's skills of being attentive to what's going on around them, and also being able to try to seek a musical kind of harmony, a kind of resonance, a kind of tempo alongside the other performers. They're seeking a rhythm, a melody, a harmony. They're not always economically utilitarian profit maximizers. They might need to be cautious risk spreaders and risk mitigators. They might well be practicing diversified livelihoods that include a farming component alongside other components. They're not necessarily able to devise and implement plans because they lack control, but they use rules of thumb and other decision-making heuristics to navigate through seasons and annual cycles. So they're grappling with contingency, they're coping with surprises, they're making decisions under contexts of uncertainty. And they're improvising, and it's important to understand that improvising, as in a musical improvisation, is not simply random churning. It's not just a random hitting of different notes to see what happens. It's based on deploying a set of practiced repertoires, routines, understanding of musicality in order to achieve a successful performance in spite of what else might be going on, in spite of what the other musicians in this performance are doing. Okay, so I don't want to over-egg the musical analogy, but I think it's quite a useful one. If you think about a group of musicians where one of them is the farmer and the others are everything else that's going on in the farming environment, including activity by other people, by livestock, by plants, and by other kinds of materials, what they're trying to achieve is a musical success in circumstances not necessarily under their control. So another tool for thinking about a technographic approach to understanding farming as a technology and farmers as technological practitioners and as performers is the theoretical concept of affordance. What is an affordance? Well, here are some quotations that might help us to understand what affordances are. Pfaffenberger said, an affordance is a perceived property of an artifact that suggests how it should be used. Hutchby said, affordances are functional and relational aspects which frame, while not determining, the possibilities for agentic action in relation to an object. Okay, so that's very jargonful, but essentially functional and relational aspects which are sort of creating possibilities for an agent to do something with or in relation to an object. Ingold said, the concept of affordance refers to the properties of an object that render it apt for the project of a subject. So there are objects around us and they have certain features, characteristics that could make them useful for our purposes. And Don Norman, who is a design professor rather than a sort of more abstract anthropologist or sociologist, said an affordance is a relationship between the properties of an object and the capabilities of the agent that determine just how the object could possibly be used. Now, this idea of affordances was first written about by an ecological psychologist called James Gibson, and he was an ecological psychologist. By the way, what that means is not that he was a psychologist of sort of environmentalism or of a sort of green sensibility. He was a psychologist of how organisms relate to their environment. Organisms endowed with senses and cognitive abilities are understanding and reading the environment around them. They read that environment not as a flat, undifferentiated tableau, but actually as a structured space. There are things here which are available to me that I could use for the things I want to achieve. To make that even simpler, here's a nice quote which might be more helpful. We can see, for example, that something can be eaten or thrown. This is an expression of what affordance is all about. As an organism in an environment with some experience and some learning, you can see that there are things around you and you can make use of them. Affordances also sometimes are constraints as well as enablers. To make it really simple, a chair affords a place to sit. A tree stump also affords a place to sit, but a chair is easier to move than a tree stump. A table affords a place to write, or maybe a place to sit and have a meal. So affordances are aspects, or they're relations in our environments between ourselves and objects and the surrounding environment. They're interactional, which is to say they're material, they're biophysical. We can actually find out what the affordances are around us by interacting with them through trial and error. They're perceptual in the sense that they only exist if somebody recognizes that there's an affordance there, which means that they also rely on some knowledge. They're experiential, you can discover, you can learn about them. And they're relational, this is really important. The affordance is not a property of the object, it's not a property of the crop, it's not a property of the livestock. It's a property of the relationship between us and the crop, between us and the livestock, between us and the fertilizer. Functional pairs might be actors who have capacities and objects that have potential uses. Now, what does that mean? Think about the fact that the affordances of a chair are very different for an infant who can't even walk yet, and an elderly person who maybe is starting to lose some of their mobility, and a fully healthy adult who has the use of all of their limbs and eyes and ears and senses. So that leads me to the last point, which is that affordances are situational. They are potentially dynamic. They can change for one individual through their lifetime. And I'm going to make a point in a moment about the relationship to development. So where do we look for these affordances in agriculture? Well, they are there in the biophysical and material interactions and relationships. There are affordances in our relationship with tools and equipment, with landscapes, with living organisms. There are affordances in our symbolic and ritual interactions. For example, in South Asia, where I've done a lot of work on rice cultivation, some tasks are considered to be men's work and some tasks are considered to be women's work. This is very common in traditional farming settings. We can also find affordances within social and economic relationships, related, for example, to household wealth, incomes, farm assets, access to finance and credit. These are often the things that agricultural economists are looking at and measuring. And it's there in the political, economic, and institutional relationships, politics, power, local governance, norms. It's also there, for example, in legal frameworks, such as the patent regime that covers genetically modified seeds, or technology agreements, end-user licenses on seeds, or on farm equipment or firmware that runs your tractor if you're a North American farmer. So how do we actually improve affordances in small-scale agriculture? And I want to suggest that this is the very essence of what development interventions are trying to achieve. They're trying to improve the affordances in small-scale agriculture. And there are two ways I think you can approach this problem, maybe both at the same time. One is to increase the agency of the practitioners. In other words, you can raise awareness of alternative technological options. You can strengthen capabilities. You can increase capacities. You can build confidence. You can provide training in new skills. And then you can attack the problem from the other direction, which is to reduce obstacles and ease constraints. You can change the technological design to make it more accessible. You can increase the availability by increasing supply. You can bring down the price to make it more accessible. You can make the technique simpler. You can do a lot of these things through engagement. But if you think of this as being a sort of, I sometimes think of it as being a bit like a market price that's trying to achieve clearing. You're bringing down the obstacles and you're raising the capabilities so that somehow they can meet, and you will increase the number of people and the number of communities that maybe could benefit from a technological design. So this is important because if the affordances of any object or an environment are different for different individuals and situations, they are potentially dynamic, which makes them modifiable by learning and by experience. And to change the affordances, you can work on the relationship in these two different directions. And I think this is the essence of what developers are trying to do, development professionals are trying to do. So this leads me to why, together with colleagues in 2016, we published a paper in Outlook on Agriculture in which we said that there's a problem with the concept of adoption and related concepts like technology transfer, technology diffusion. Because according to this technographic framework, technology is not something people have or lack, because everybody is a technological practitioner. And it's not something that can be transferred as discrete units, like a black box from one place to another. Technology is actually something people do. Technology is something people make. And when technology moves, it's not simply transferred from one place to another, like a black box that's passed from the creator to the user, and then plugged in like a sort of a tool that you can plug in and switch on. If this transfer is to be successful, the technology has to be remade in situ. It has to be incorporated, integrated into a set of practices that make sense locally for the community on the ground. It involves a local reconfiguration of social and technical practices and social material relations. Now, the concept of adoption is still widely used in impact evaluation studies in agriculture for development and in other fields of development. But the idea that the technology is invented by someone or some organization and then transferred as a fixed package and then it's adopted, it's highly problematic in practice. Anybody who's spent some time in the field or has worked as an evaluator will know that when you go to the field, you're looking for something called adoption, and it's quite difficult to spot. Because very often what happens doesn't resemble the original design in quite the way it was conceived by the designers and the inventors of this thing. So empirically, we find that the technology as designed is often ignored, which leads to this widely lamented phenomenon. You hear about people in our field talk about it all the time, the idea of non-adoption and the complaint that there are proven technologies that have been proven in experiments. They work in the lab, they work in the field, they work in the research station, but they're left on the shelf. They're not being adopted. Well, we need to understand that phenomenon. What you often observe, and I've seen this myself with, for example, the system of rice intensification, is that the technology is unpacked, it's decomposed, it's reassembled, it's reconfigured into a local practice, a redesign that the designer or inventor might not have anticipated or planned. They might not have intended it. In some cases, they might object to it. For example, if you're a commercial operator and somebody is stealing your technology and appropriating it in ways that don't benefit you, don't benefit your bottom line, you're going to be upset about that. But there is agency on both sides of this relationship. And if evaluators are looking for something called adoption, they might not be very well equipped to detect or understand what they're looking at. And by the way, I think you can end up with two different kinds of sort of unfortunate outcome from an evaluation. One is, I like to call it, it's not a precise analogy, but it's a sort of false positive, which says, okay, a good number of the target population took up our technology, and therefore we achieved some good results. But if you're not paying attention to the other things going on, you might have caused some harm, and you're not even detecting it because you're not looking for it. And the other, obviously, is the false negative. You're very disappointed because you spent $1 million or $10,000, and you you set yourself a target to influence the practices of 500 farmers or 500,000 farmers, and in the end, barely 5% of them are even engaging with your technology, and 2 years later, there's no sign that your project was there at all. Verdict, bad investment, we achieved nothing with this project, but you might actually have achieved some positive things because, but again, it's to do with the way you designed the intervention, how you actually brought the technology. You might have mobilized some community activity that didn't exist before. You might have brought people together to share information in ways that they weren't doing before. You might have had some beneficial impacts, but with the tools of adoption studies, you're not looking for them and you don't see them. So, part of our argument is that conventional methods and techniques of technology promotion and evaluation have not taken into account progress that's been achieved in various academic fields, in sociology of technology and in anthropology and policy studies, in advancing our understanding of technology and technological change. So in our paper that we published in 2019 called Rethinking Technological Change, we reviewed some of these theories, and some of them have been more influential than others on mainstream practices of technology promotion and evaluation techniques, particularly, for example, the 5 in the left-hand column. Let me talk first of all about these 3: diffusion theory, induced innovations theory, evolutionary approaches. Now, the ideas of technology transfer and adoption, they fit rather well with those 3. Where technology is conceived as a sort of mobile black box that moves from one place to another, sort of plug-and-play concept. There's the famous diffusion theory of Everett Rogers, a sort of epidemiological metaphor of how new technology spreads through society. You have induced innovations theory, where technological change is sort of the dependent outcome of a change in resource scarcity, resource prices. This is the idea of necessity being the mother of invention. But often the content of the technology is sort of set aside within this understanding of induced innovations theory. So it sort of explains why people might change the way they do things, but it doesn't necessarily say anything about the process or the content of that change. And then in evolutionary approaches, new technologies are seen as rather akin to species in an ecosystem and trying to survive. Again, the technology is rather in a black box. Is it going to be adopted or not? We'll wait to see. In critical political economy approaches, they recognize practitioners' agency to some degree. They understand that technologies are socially shaped, but technology is largely seen as a sort of independent variable here, and it's often seen as being under the control of some dominant player, like big corporations or big science or big business. Or they might say that it's reshapable by political struggle, for example, by challenging patent regimes. But again, the actual content of the technology is not really unpacked in these critical political economy approaches. And then there's a field which, by the way, I have a lot of sympathy with, the agricultural innovation systems literature. It does recognize that there's the agency of multiple players involved in shaping technologies and the spread and the uptake of those technologies. And this is where people often talk about multi-stakeholder innovation platforms. You bring together your small startup, your established company, your broker, your community, and then you achieve some kind of technological change. But actually, again, often the technological content, the change process itself is not really unpacked or really understood. So in our paper, we argued that social science analysis of technological change has developed in a range of other ways, and they're not really well recognized or incorporated into mainstream theories and practices or the toolkits of impact evaluators. And I'm talking particularly about the 5 in the second column. So the social construction of technology and the social shaping of technology, they understand that technology involves an assemblage or a network of human and non-human actors, sometimes called actants, that are linked and organized to achieve material transformations. Participatory and social learning approaches emphasize processes of social negotiation, participatory action, interactive learning. And actor-oriented approaches emphasize the role of encounters at the interface between different communities of knowledge and practice. So between scientists and farmers, between extensionists and farmers, between farmers and farmers. So all of these are bringing more kind of human and social understandings of technological change. And now the final emphasis here on technology as situated practice or performance, which is the technographic approach that I started talking about at the beginning of the presentation, which we can see through the lens of the idea of habitus, for example, where technological systems are expressions of cultural traditions and cultural institutions, which are often traditional, not in the sense of being ancient, not in the sense of being some sort of romantic tradition, but traditional in the sense that they belong to a community of practice and they're passed from one cohort of generation to the next. That doesn't mean that they're not changing, but they are held by a culture and not within the individual. And the classic example from the work of Marcel Mauss was having had the experience of being a soldier in the trenches of the Western Front of the First World War. He observed that the British troops and French troops, who were sometimes alternating in the same section of the front line, when you switched French soldiers for British soldiers or vice versa, you also had to change the entrenching tools, the shovels and the spades, because French people dug trenches differently, used a different technique with different tools. In other words, they were both making the same output, a trench, but they were doing so in a very different cultural way. So these things, we do have some tools for understanding technological change without using this concept of adoption. So let me summarize what I think are the problems with the concept of adoption. It's too linear, it's too binary, it's too simplistic. It implies a simple once-for-all, one-for-one substitution of Y instead of X. Empirically, what we very often observe is not just a replication of a standard design, but there's a range of variation or adaptation. By the way, in practice, if you read evaluation studies in the literature, they quite often fail to specify what they mean by adoption, how we know that somebody's adopted something. They sometimes take visible artifacts as symbols of technological change. But in fact, there's agency on both sides of the relationship between the intervention and a target population of users. The users sometimes do things that are unexpected, unanticipated, unintended by the designers or the intervention. So in our 2019 paper, we came up with a framework which we called PEDRO. Actually, originally we called it the PEDR. We added the O later. It was an obvious thing to do. I don't know why we didn't think of it at the time. P stands for propositions, E is encounters, D is for dispositions, R is for responses, and O is for outcomes. And the argument is that PEDRO is better aligned with the range of current thinking and with theoretical concepts about what technology actually is and how technological change actually occurs. And I'm going to unpack each of these elements. The framework seeks to recognize that there are diverse actors and divergent forms of agency involved in a process of technological change, and to try to look at the change process through the agency of the technological practitioners, the ones who are actually involved in the doing and the making. So what do we mean by propositions? And one of the things I've been discussing with the colleagues at the Department of Science Communications is that this is a very communicative. It's an initial idea, it's a concept, it's a suggestion, an invitation, a message to say something you could try, something you could do differently if you want to achieve new or different outcomes. And we said it has three components. One is biophysical and material components, so this is what we often call the inputs in agriculture, but there are also methods, techniques, and practices. The third one is that very often in agricultural development interventions, there's an implication that you should be doing farming for a particular reason. For example, for profit making as a commercial enterprise, farming as a business, or if you're an agroecological civil society organization, it might be a different mode. You might say that it's to do with farming for subsistence, farming for sustainability, farming for conservation of biodiversity. Let's move to encounters. Now, this is the occasion or the arena where the proposition is brought to people's attention, and it can be deliberately orchestrated by an external agency, such as an extension program, a sales representative, a farmer field school, a demonstration plot. It can emerge in unplanned ways through the agency of a farmer or a laborer, for example, through gossip, through listening to the radio, through a YouTube video, through seeing posters and advertising, talking to somebody in the local tea shop. Dispositions, what we mean here is essentially how receptive a particular group might be to taking up the proposition and whether they find the encounter congenial or not. There are different dispositions for different actors, and that's the most important point. They have a structural aspect. It's how people are situated and positioned. So these are the kinds of things, again, that the agricultural economists are often looking for. It's about how much wealth, how many assets, how many livestock, how many bicycles, how many tractors you have, how much access you have to finance or credit. There's also an agentic aspect. In other words, it's about individual aspirations and values. It's about skills. It's about self-confidence, psychological factors. The variety of dispositions is shaped both by these individual characteristics and circumstances of people and households, by the dynamics and the quality of the encounter, and by features of the proposition. And each of the three components of the proposition, the material, the practical, and the relational, can create a specific set of affordances for different individuals and groups. Combinations of cultural, economic, biophysical, spatial, temporal, and other factors shape perceptions of a proposition. They generate a spectrum of multiple, unique dispositions among the variety of people and households that encounter the proposition, and those determine whether and in what ways a proposition is perceived as being relevant and interesting for each individual decision maker. So think, for example, about the fact that the proposition might appear very different to a male-headed household or a female-headed household. It might look very different to a younger or an older person. It might look very different to a person with large amount of land, a person with very little land. Again, these dispositions are where there are potential modifications that you can make. Okay, I'll move to the responses. This is really one of the key reasons why we wrote the paper in the first place, is because, as I've explained, we were dissatisfied with the idea that the outcome is always either adoption or disadoption, or possibly non-adoption. Adoption or non-adoption, or possibly disadoption after having adopted for a while. Because there's a whole range of things that happen. And to put these into categories, I was very pleased when I came up with this. Here are some ways that you could respond. You could ignore, say, not of interest to me, thank you very much. You could explore, you could say, okay, that could be interesting, I'm going to have a look, I'm going to experiment, I'm going to participate in some farmer field schools, or I'm going to visit the demonstration plot. You could deplore, and this is what happens when, for example, a community that is really committed to organic farming or agroecological methods, they take a look at your, for example, your transgenic crop or your mineral fertilizer, and they say, not only are we not interested in this technology, but we actually oppose it. We don't like it at all. Or you could simply adore it. You could say, this is fantastic. I am going all in. I'm jumping in with both feet, investing all my resources. I think it's great. Okay, finally, outcomes. I'm not going to dwell on these, but the point being, I guess it's obvious, is that the outcomes are likely diverse and heterogeneous for different people and groups. So the implications of a technological design might be very different for a young woman versus an older man, a person who's completed year 12 education versus someone who dropped out of school, a person with farm assets versus someone without land. And it depends on capabilities and capacities, aspirations, and so on. So some implications. I've been hosted at UPLB by the Science Communication Department of the CDC, and through these conversations, I've seen more clearly than before how the Pedro framework can be analysed through a communicative lens. It's clear that propositions and encounters have a communicative aspect, that responses have a communicative aspect, especially if you see them as a reply to the proposition. But I think basically the Pedro framework can be used for the analysis and evaluation of technological change ex ante to inform the design and guide the implementation of a technological change intervention, and ex post to inform the evaluation. And I would suggest that what we need to do is study the ramifications of a technological change intervention. I use ramifications rather than impacts. You know, we intervened here, then what happened? We need to do that in non-deterministic ways, with fewer preconceptions about what we think the technology is for, how we think it ought to be used, by whom, for what. Instead, we should see what people actually do with the ideas and materials that we've introduced. We should think about the proposition and how it's supposed to appeal to a particular target audience. How accessible is it? How compatible is it with the existing setup? How flexible is it? How adaptable is it? We can ask, how will the encounter be organized and orchestrated? How will the target population be identified, and how are we going to engage with those people? And are we going to do so in a way which is welcoming and inclusive, or are we going to do so in ways that are inclusive only to certain groups, for example? What kind of dispositions can we anticipate, and how are we going to explore those dispositions? And what range of responses are we potentially catering for? How flexible and adaptable is our design? Are we catering only for a very precise segment of the population, or are we offering a design that's got a wider range of possible uses? And how diverse are the potential outcomes for your intervention? So I think at the level of overarching principle, the role of agricultural research for development is affirmed as enriching and broadening and deepening the selection of feasible and effective options available to poor and small-scale farmers so that they can use them to improve their lot. We're not looking for best practices or fixed technology packages. We shouldn't be trying to predict and identify winners, but we should be creating technological options with broader and more inclusive affordances that cater to more diverse capabilities, that generate and promote more flexible and adaptable options. And these can be accompanied by communication, extension, and training that's designed to help farmers to adapt and adjust things to suit their circumstances. Now, I mentioned earlier that the paper we wrote in 2019 has had a very positive reaction. It's been the single paper in my career that's the only time that I've ever started receiving unsolicited emails from people saying, "I loved your paper, it was great," which is tremendously gratifying for me. And I find it very exciting that there's an appetite for these ideas and that people have started to take them up, because at the moment, I'm comfortable that the Pedro framework is a good descriptive framework for what goes on in technological change. And as I've said, I think it can be used ex ante and ex post. But it definitely needs to be unpacked, operationalized, instrumented. We need to work out practical ways that it could be used in the field. And is it useful? Is it affordable? Does it generate data that we can make sense of? And some of the people that are already working with Pedro today include the names listed on here. And since I arrived, also our colleagues in CDC. So I'm happy to see that. So there's a lot of unpacking in the individual components, the P, the E, the D, the R, and the O. And I'm looking forward to further engagements. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Dominic. That was a very insightful presentation, and I believe it provided us fresh perspectives on technology and adoption and the concepts such as affordances. So I believe many of you are practitioners here and also researchers. I believe you were able to somehow reflect on Dominic's presentation, and he will give us a copy of his presentation so that if you want to read more about his research, definitely we can link you through his journal articles, perhaps. So, aside from you reflecting on his presentation, we've invited a few reactors from our partners to give their perspectives on Dominic's presentation. So, from the three, let's hear it first. Joining us online, he is the Chief Executive Officer of Carbon Farm. We have with us Mr. Vasily Carantino. Mr. Vasily, are you here?
Yeah, I'm here. It's nice to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. And thank you, Dr. Glover, for your insightful presentation. So I'll love to share my screen and explain a little bit more, what Carbon Farm does and how it relates to this topic, and then provide a few thoughts on the Pedro framework. Can you see my screen? Is
Yes.
my screen visible?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, fantastic. So Carbon Farm, we are an MRV provider and a carbon project developer specialized in rice. And so the reason we are working on rice is obviously rice has a very important climate impact. It represents about 12% of the world methane emissions. So just to put that into perspective, comparing those emissions, obviously methane has a very, very strong climate warming potential, especially in the short term. So if we look at the impact of those 12% of methane over 10 years, that roughly corresponds to 4 times the climate warming impact of the aviation industry. And rice also uses about 40% of the world irrigation water. So we need 5,000 liters of rice to produce 1 kilogram of 1,000 liters of water to produce 1 kilogram of rice. And it doesn't have to be that way. So there are ways to grow rice sustainably. And Dr. Glover mentioned SRI, the system of rice intensification, which is a very good practices. There are also other interventions like alternate wetting and drying that have been very popular over the years. And being in Los Baños, you're probably all very well aware of those practices. So those practices can reduce emissions and can essentially reduce water usage by about 30%. And carbon markets are an interesting concept to incentivize farmers to adopt those practices at scale. And they work in 3 key steps. So, farmers adopt practices that reduce emissions. So most of the time, this is done in the context of a carbon project. So the project developer is really the one helping the farmers transition to sustainable practices, doing the farming extension, ensuring that this adoption of new technology sticks within the farmer community. Then comes the step of measurement, reporting, and verification of the practices. So this is our main expertise at Carbon Farm. It's really about detecting, assessing the farming practices in place in a project area and quantifying how it translates into greenhouse gases. And then finally comes the step of generating carbon credits, issuing carbon credits, and selling them on carbon markets to finance the farming extension, but also to finance and incentives for the farmers to change. So, the reason we started working on this is historically monitoring is done with paper logbooks, which is not very robust. It's very hard to collect in smallholder settings, and it's a very difficult. It's very difficult to collect. It's also not a very good proof or evidence of change, and so that led to a number of problems in carbon markets, with a number of projects that were cancelled by carbon registries. And so at Carbon Farm, we offer satellite-based monitoring of farming practices, so notably the water management, the way the rice is seeded, the straw management, all of this to establish, to quantify the greenhouse gases stemming from the rice cultivation. So we are really able to detect a change in farming practices and evaluate how it translates into greenhouse gas savings. And so that allows essentially to facilitate access to carbon markets. So this is really what we're doing, and also allows to kind of have a higher price for the carbon credits that get generated, because we have stronger evidence of change. So our value proposition is really to work with anyone really that have a contact with the farmers, and that can be a developer or a project partner implementing the project on the ground. So that can be NGOs, it can be farming organizations, it can be agribusinesses. And they are the one working with farmer community on training programs to ensure that the practices adoptions happen. And we take care of the connection to carbon market, handling the satellite monitoring, the carbon certification, as well as some elements of support on project financing and carbon credit sales. All of this with the objective to return as much revenue as possible to the farming communities as incentive for adopting the new practices. So with that in mind, I'll stop sharing my screen now. I hope that clarifies a little bit what Carbon Farm does. With that in mind, I'd love to propose a little bit of some thoughts on and reactions to the Pedro framework and the discussion we just had. So Carbon Farm's role is really to co-develop and monitor carbon projects, and which essentially means we're trying to promote a new technology, a new package of agricultural practices and technologies. And in the paper of Dr. Glover is very interesting, as we've been ourselves struggling with the adoption concept. I very much agree with the assessment of Dr. Glover in his paper that the change in farming practices is never binary, and when we observe things with satellites, we really see this. It's not about continuous flooding or alternate wetting and drying. It's always somewhere in the middle. We can see farmers intenting the change, doing one drainage event, but not going to the full package adoption. Some people adopting for 1 year and then reverting back to the historical practices. So it is really like it's difficult to say yes, this farmer has adopted a technology package. It's always like a gradient, and in that sense, I think this new framework is very helpful, not only to think and kind of measure the success of a carbon program, but also to design a carbon project in the right way. So the number of thoughts I noted. The first is that the number one criteria of a carbon program success is the quality of implementation, and this really means the relevance of the intervention for the farming communities, and for example, SRI can only be done in contexts where there is full control of water. In places where there is water risk, farmers are not sure whether they can put water again in the field. It's very difficult for them to dry their paddy. And so the concept of proposition is a framework that allows us to test the relevance of a technology change in the specific context of a farming community. The second point is obviously for us, the quality of the implementation partner and the support that is given to the farmers in the transition towards new technologies is very key. It very often explains the difference in successes between different programs, and we are to caricature a little bit, we are seeing two main types of carbon programs. There's carbon programs that are just signing farmers, going around and giving farmers money in exchange for a contract, and that's all there is. And on the other hand, there is carbon programs where there is truly a support and with multiple touch points with the farmers to facilitate the transition. And so this is something we're very aware of in our own evaluation of the quality of implementation. And I think the concept that is presented in the paper of encounters really it encapsulates this notion and is quite useful in that regard. The disposition and response concept are also very helpful to better understand and adapt the strategy of a program. So, does the project stimulate interest? Are farmers signing up to a carbon project? And after the first season, after the first test, are practices sticking to the farming community, or is it not the case? And I think this is not only useful for evaluation, as I mentioned, but it's also helpful for the design. And so, for example, we are seeing that some of the most successful programs are programs where there is a co-design of the practices, a co-construction of the practices and the technology with the farmers. And that is the case for SRI, for example, where it's a set of principles that are, can be interpreted by the farming communities and can be adapted to the local context. And that explains the good success of SRI in certain regions. So to conclude, I'd like to comment that this framework, I believe it's a great asset for anyone working in farming extension, including as Carbon Farm, carbon project developers that are essentially promoting new technologies, and it's useful in evaluation of the quality of a program, but also in just the design phase, in thinking the design of a program and how to optimize the affordance of technology.
All right. Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Carantino, for sharing with us about your work at Carbon Farm and your thoughts on Dr. Glover's presentation. Up next,
Thank you.
our next reactor we have from Grow Asia. She is the Regional Manager for Programs. We have Ms. Erica Sale. Ms. Erica?
Yeah, thank you so much, Sunny. Hello, good day, everyone. As mentioned already, I am Erica, Regional Manager for Programs of Grow Asia. Yep, there you go. So thank you so much, Dominic, Dr. Glover, for a wonderful presentation. And the paper that really redirected us to a more pragmatic approach or framework to technological change in smallholder agriculture. Vasily already provided a lot of excellent points and reflections, and I will try my best not to repeat the points that he already shared. But let me start by giving a brief background about what is Grow Asia. So Grow Asia is a multi-stakeholder platform that navigates the nexus of commercial and nonprofit partnerships to create an ecosystem that supports knowledge sharing, collaboration, innovation, and policy change. Onto the next slide, our governance structure actually reflects a commitment to the multi-stakeholder collaboration that this slide presents. So we have a business council, which is a high-level advisory body that brings together company leaders. And on the other hand, we also have advisory council, which is an independent advisory body comprised of government agencies, nonprofit entities, and non-government organizations. And of course, at the regional level, we won't be able to really do much work without any country chapters. So in the next slide, we have 5 country chapters across Southeast Asia, which serves the national platform for the public-private partnerships dedicated to promoting sustainable and regenerative agriculture. So Grow Asia, as the regional secretariat, works with each country chapter and its locally based secretariat such as TPSA, which co-organized this session and is also with us today. So we work together to really align the specificity of each country. So leveraging everything on this partnership, we have launched what we call the Public-Private Impact Fund to accelerate transformation in Southeast Asia. So in the next slide, maybe I'll just browse quickly this 4 quadrants. So Grow Her focuses on amplifying women's role in agriculture and their important contribution to improving agricultural practices in smallholder farms. So Grow Right, on the other hand, is supporting capacity building for responsible investing. Grow Beyond at the moment is driving the development of a blended finance facility and technical assistance that will empower small businesses to accelerate climate change adaptation and resilience. And last but not the least, Grow Ventures focuses on agri-food innovation. So transitioning to the next slide and transitioning to low carbon economy, I think as already described and explained by Vasily earlier, it requires a shift into a collaborative innovation ecosystem, the way he explains the different programs or projects that run their technology. And it really needs to overcome the fragmented delivery systems and foster investment in agri-food innovation. So connecting this with the presentation, I think the question for all of us is how can we ensure that the propositions presented to the farmers are not only technically sound, but also culturally and contextually relevant to their specific circumstances. And I think the Pedro framework is really important or it's really up to use in the Philippine context. So here in the Philippines, we are seeing a demographic shift in the agriculture space. So there is an already aging farmer population. Multiple studies pointed out that there is a limited interest amongst youth in agriculture-related careers. So it would be interesting to break this down into how the shift in demographics influences the practices and relationships that Dominic has pointed out earlier, and how this could be used to unpack the development within the agriculture sector. The idea highlighted earlier that proposition is a combination of resources, methods, and modes of engagement is actually intriguing. Um, yeah, to accelerate climate smart innovations and digital solutions across the region in Grow Asia, what we do is take diverse and complex challenges and present best practices across different value chains into accessible digital knowledge materials. We also have been running innovation challenges that identify, promote, and seek to deploy best-in-class technologies and digital solutions to solve value chain specific challenges. So, and just recently, Grow Asia actually proudly announced Carbon Farm as the winner for the technology that Cecily has shared. And as he pointed out, it is a continued process still on their end for that technology that he shared. And it is interesting how the Pedro framework could be used to address and nuance diverse agricultural practices among different regions. Or as the concept of the technographic, as explained earlier, really nuanced practices and relationships in the sector. And I think what mechanisms can be put maybe into place to validate the assumptions our assumptions about farmer motivations, capabilities before interventions are designed or even redesigned because as Vasily pointed out, it's a continuous work even on the technology side. And moving to the next slide, I think as emphasized, leveraging on the different partnerships and country chapters, we really seek to support and advocate digital innovation that put farmers at the center or to really co-design the process. And the number you see on the screen is a collective effort of this partnership. And looking back to the presentation again, I think the concept of encounters as relational and co-produced events highlights the need for a really participatory approach and really communicating amongst each other. So in agricultural development, I think the challenge of documenting the small incremental changes that each of us contribute to remain as communication interfaces evolve and putting those collective small actions more concretely and communicating them more effectively to investors, to donors is a continued work. And I like the way Dr. Glover pointed out that Pedro could also be used in a communicative way on how we really communicate the work that we do or it has been done in the space. And that's only one side. I think another interesting reminder that came up from the presentation is in what ways can we track the evolution of farmers' disposition towards new technologies over time? So I think he explained that dispositions change due to evolving experiences, and using this theory of affordances raises the question of how both the supply and the demand of technology could benefit from a really strong feedbacking mechanism. And the framework suggests that responses to this can be diverse and complex. And it really raises how we can develop evaluation methods that capture this richness and the richness that could probably measure beyond adoption rate, which Dr. Glover already pointed out very early on in this presentation. And looping it back again on the development side and probably ending here on this note as well, given the potential of the Pedro framework to unpack driving technology beyond adoption, I think it would be also interesting to use it to nuance the unintended consequences and establish safeguards to identify, mitigate, and probably monitor unintended or maybe negative impacts, if ever, as farmers respond to outcomes of agricultural technology.
Okay, thank you very much, Miss Erica. That's Miss Erica from Asia. So she touched on several aspects of the presentation and on how it can be contextualized to the work that they do in Southeast Asia, particularly on climate smart innovation. So thank you very much, Miss Erica. Now on to our final reactor. Joining us live here at SEARCA, we have our very own the Program Specialist for Emerging Innovation for Growth Department of SEARCA, Ms. Lichelle Dara Carlos.
Hello, good afternoon. So congratulations to Vasily of Carbon Farm for winning the Innovation Challenge run by Grow Asia. And thank you, Dr. Grover, for presenting the PEDRO approach to analyzing technological change. This could indeed inform the design, implementation, and evaluation of interventions in small-scale agriculture. So as a reaction, allow me to take the PEDRO, proposition, encounter, disposition, results, outcome lens to frame the experience of our SEARCA grantees in introducing relatively early stage or prototype technologies to help farmers adapt to the increasing unpredictability of the immediate climate conditions. These prototype projects in Indonesia, next slide please, Philippines and Thailand were supported by the SEARCA grants for research towards agriculture innovative solutions, or GRAINS, which is administered by our department, the Emerging Innovation for Growth. Let's talk about P, propositions. In terms of propositions, all three projects offered automated information backed by AI, IoT hardware sensors, satellite data that will help farmers make decisions and adjustments on their farm operations. This is Indonesia. The Aquanotes app here provides real-time water quality and feed density monitoring to optimize the conditions and increase shrimp survival in hatchery ponds, like by 17% to 32%. On the next slide, our experience in the Philippines with space crop technology. This one predicts the soil moisture in the farms, kind of similar to the satellite technology that Vasily presented earlier. And through satellite data, so that the cacao farmers here can manage their water supply or irrigation. The third example from Thailand, this is Fafon app. Okay, it provides accurate plot-specific weather information, such as rain, wind conditions, which helps here, in this case, the durian farmers plan the timing of their activities and any mitigation measures. For example, when to spray and when to create drainage canals to manage heavy rains. So all of these farmer encounters, okay, as you can tell, these solutions or these technologies are beyond just a simple substitution, right, of brand X for brand Y. They are really complex, and the propositions come in the form of prototypes, apps, very early communication of the benefits, right? So all the farmer encounters were actually facilitated by enablers from academia, government, and agriculture industry. So with the SEARCA funding support, a university, for example, and an aquaculture bureau in Indonesia, the Cacao Council and the Trade Department in Davao City in the Philippines, and in Thailand, the city mayor and the Digital Promotion Agency, they were all engaged and facilitated the meetings, the introductions, the training with the farmers. So the endorsement of multi-stakeholders is critical for meaningful and I would say choreographed encounters. Let's talk about the disposition. Affecting the farmer's disposition to consider the technology are the complexity of the digital technologies and the context of available infrastructure, current practices that they have, external technical support, and more. For example, in Indonesia case, the hatchery ponds, they need individual hardware installation and app subscriptions before they could really optimize the use of that technology. Spacecraft technology was developed in irrigated European farms, so they need ground truth validation in Philippine conditions of rain-fed, actually, cacao farms. Meanwhile, in Thailand, there were already 300 Fafonsense automated weather stations installed all over the country. With the additional 10 installations supported by the grains projects, the durian farmers in the project area had an easier time to just download the free app and start using it right away. So the farmer familiarity with digital banking and social media apps that they already have in their devices created an easy entry. Let's talk about the response then. As an initial response to these very early propositions and early encounters in Indonesia, there were initially 130 hatchery farmers who signed up for Aquanotes, and this is even before there was hardware installation in their farms. And this is indicative to me of the exploration response, as described by Dr. Grover. Well, in the Philippines, 10 farms are currently in the process of giving access to validation testing activities of spacecraft in the cacao farms. And this is indicative somehow going into the deplore kind of response. In Thailand, the durian farmers told us that they use Fafon app every day as they are getting 90% accuracy compared with generic weather reports from the media, which is like 70% accuracy for them. And that sort of describes an adore kind of response. But these initial responses will either grow or drop out through the next cycle. And the outcomes, therefore, of these projects indicate really the non-linear nature of technological change. Farmers' responses to technology are dynamic and iterative, often involving multiple cycles of encounters, disposition shifts, and reassessment. Technology developers and startup ventures, in turn, adjust their propositions and business models based on these interactions. Importantly, farmers, we call them technology practitioners, do not engage with these technologies in an all-or-nothing manner. They tend to test and adjust individual components or features before fully committing to the technology, allowing for a more gradual and flexible process. In conclusion, the technographic approach underscores that technological change in agriculture is a process of continuous adaptation and negotiation between developers, farmers, and other stakeholders. The experiences of the SEARCA grantees show that the path to widespread technological change is neither straightforward nor linear, but is shaped by ongoing interactions, feedback loops, and the need for contextual adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lichelle, for, of course, outlining the Pedro framework and then citing examples from the SEARCA grantees. So thank you very much to our panel of reactors, Mr. Vasily, Ms. Erica, and then Ms. Lichelle. Now we're going to give back the floor to Dr. Glover for his response to the reactions from the panel.
Actually, I'm going to keep this as short as possible because all I would like to say is to really appreciate all three reactors for responding with such thoughtful and interesting remarks and examples of really interesting interventions, technological change programs, and for, I guess, thinking on their feet as well, because as far as I know, you didn't get advanced sight of the slides. You've given me a lot of food for thought, and it's really exciting to me to learn about these programs and projects. But that's all I have to say, because I'd love to hear from the wider audience. Thanks.
All right, so thank you very much, Dr. Glover, and a round of applause to our reactors as well, from Carbon Farm, Grow Asia, and here from here, SEARCA. And then, of course, Dr. Glover is excited to hear from our audience. We have a very small group here, although we also have participants joining us online. If you have any questions, for those joining us here, please use the microphone. For those who are joining us online, there is an instruction for you to type your questions in the comment section. And for the participants here, if you're not comfortable asking the question live, we have a QR code where you can type in your questions. But we do encourage you to raise your hand and ask the question directly and use the microphone. Anyone from the group? Yes, ma'am. Please use the microphone.
Good afternoon. I am Ellen, a graduate student. I would like to know what are the limitations of technographic approach in addressing large-scale technological transitions in agriculture, such as the adoption in precision farming. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. It's a big question. I think it's probably something we should discuss over a cup of coffee or something. What are the limitations of a technographic approach for assessing large-scale technological transitions? Was that have I summarized the question well? I guess you could argue that the technographic approach, because it appears to be based on a sort of ethnography, which is it's traditionally about observing the interactions within, for example, traditional communities. I guess in this room we probably know something about the traditions of anthropology as opposed to, for example, sociology, and how the traditions of those disciplines kind of approached similar aspects of society, but from different directions and in different contexts, particularly colonial contexts. So I suppose one might say that maybe because technography is a sort of ethnographic approach, and thus it tends to be focusing on like the micro scale, the intimate interaction between peoples and tools. But personally, I feel that you can use a technographic approach across scales, all the way from an individual using a specific tool to achieve a certain result, to a large system like a power grid, a city sewage system, a nuclear power station. Even you could look at entire societies and their practices around mobility, for example. Because I think that the working concept of technology being about people and their practices and their relationships, rather than about gadgets and devices or machines, that I think that applies across scales. But as a researcher, it's all about specifying your question and choosing your conceptual framework to suit that, and specifying and instrumenting it to make it appropriate to your study. I hope that makes some sense, but I'll be happy to chat with you more about it. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Glover. Any further questions from the audience? Okay. Hello, Dr. Glover.
My name is Renz from the Department of Science Communication. First of all, thank you for your presentation. This is actually a question I've been mulling over for the last couple of weeks since I first encountered your article. We've seen how the PEDRO framework has been applied to retrospective studies in analyzing projects that have been applied already in the past. My question is, do you think there's a possibility to apply the PEDRO framework in prospective studies? Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Are you volunteering, Renz? Because maybe we could write a proposal. I would love to. Yeah, I don't see any obstacles to doing that at all, and I think it would be a really a cool way to apply the PEDRO framework, because I think you could study the design, the implementation, and the evaluation of a project in real time. You could, for example, try. As Lichelle suggested, how you track, I can't remember now, was it you, or tracking the change in dispositions over time? That would be really interesting. So, yeah, in short, yes, I think you can.
Okay, thank you, Renz and Dr. Glover. Any further questions from the group? Na pong mahiya. May pakain mamaya. Okay, while you're thinking about your question, I have a question for Dr. Glover. Not really a personal question, but something about your positionality as a researcher. Can you share with us, sir, about your influences in terms of your geographical locations on certain regions of the world where you work, for us to better understand your positionality as a researcher?
Yes, that's. How do I answer that question? My positionality as a researcher, I'm going to try and answer it in a way that doesn't give you like an entire sort of history of my academic career. I mean, I do have a rather indirect academic career to where I am today, because I did a bachelor's degree in law, and then a few years later I did a master's in international political economy. And then a few years after that, I did my PhD, and my PhD is in development studies, but as I often say, development studies is not a discipline, it's a field. During my PhD, I used, as the presentation I think reflects, I used concepts from science and technology studies. Some of my academic publications nowadays are in geography journals, or in rural studies, or in agronomy journals. So that's some of my background. In terms of my empirical work, so interestingly enough, some of my work has been in the Philippines, but I actually haven't set foot in the Philippines for 10 years. Not for want of trying, I might add. We submitted some funding proposals and they weren't successful, unfortunately, so I'm very glad to be back. I've done a great deal of work on rice cultivation systems. So a lot of my understanding of technology and technological change comes from studies of rice and rice cultivation here in the Philippines, in India, in Nepal, in Madagascar. And as I mentioned in the presentation, I've done a lot of work and published a lot on the system of rice intensification. Now that's a really interesting example of where, in fact, as Vasily mentioned in his reaction, in principle, SRI is supposed to be a flexible suite of agronomic principles which you can then adjust and adapt to suit your circumstances. And in fact, if you look back at the origins of SRI in the work of Father Henri de Lolanier, the French Jesuit priest and agronomist who worked with marginal rice farmers in the highlands of Madagascar between I forget the dates now, from 1960 to his death in 1994, 95. So the story of SRI is, according to his conception, was that it was adaptable and flexible according to, for example, your latitude, your altitude, the temperature, the season, the variety, the soil richness. But in practice, what has happened with the SRI community is very often that it gets packaged as a fixed package. and it gets promoted in different countries and different locations with a rather rigid set of practices. For example, that seedlings should be transplanted between 8 and 15 days, that they should be planted singly, that they should be planted 25 centimeters apart. That's not what Henri de Lolani actually said. He said that you should plant your spacing distance according to how rich your soil is, which makes sense from an agronomist's point of view. But by the way, there's a question here for Winfried and his colleagues in the Department of Science Communication. I think it's a dilemma for a system like SRI, which is supposed to be flexible and adaptable. But if you want to make it mobile so that it can move from one community or one community of practice to another, sometimes through that process of the distillation of the idea into a neat, communicable package that you can talk to somebody else about, it sometimes gets simplified, it gets rationalized and codified into a sort of discrete set of steps. And some of the things that Henri de Lolani talked about got forgotten in the process. So in my view, some of the ideas about making rice cultivation suit your locale have been lost in translation, literally lost in translation from one place to another. So that's a little bit about how I came to these ideas. Thanks.
That's Dr. Glover. So he did mention about SRI. I wonder if anyone here is from Philrice or Erie would like to challenge his theories and stuff. Okay, any final question from the group? Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon. Marisol Sahise from Benguet State University, at the same time a college graduate student here. How can you, my question is on the technological affordance and the realities of citizen science, how these two might be a part of this technographic approach. Can you comment on this aspect where citizen science now is a trend actually in the empirical research?
I have to ask you for clarification, I'm sorry. So you said the concept of technological affordance and the reality of citizen science, but I don't really understand the question, I'm sorry.
Can you comment on that aspect where in the citizen science it's more on how we connect the lay people in the empirical aspects in the research, where for this particular approach, I think we still have to involve the citizens, right? So I'm just thinking, how will these two be part and parcel of this particular approach in your paradigm that you showed a while ago, particularly with Pedro?
Mm-hmm. Okay. So let me say this. I mean, for me, what is enriching about the concept of affordance is the very fact that it sensitizes us to the reality that affordance is a relationship between an actor and the possibilities in their environment. And what I mean by sensitizing us to that, as I explained in the presentation, is that the affordances could be very different for different people, depending on how they are placed and depending on how much knowledge they have and how much self-confidence they have and how much money they have, and all of those other things that go up to make our capabilities. In other words, the things that we're capable of are partly about us and our skills and knowledge, and partly about the context where we are. And both of those things are modifiable, as I talked about in the presentation. So let me relate that to citizen science. I mean, I guess one of the ways, practical way of operationalizing that idea is that well, in fact, let me relate it to the idea of the encounter, because one of the reasons why I was inspired, for example, by the idea of encounters as written about by Norman Long, who was a sociology professor at Wageningen, actually before the time that I was there, but he talked about encounters at the interface between different communities of knowledge. And I think the point there is that there are multiple different kinds of expertise. There's a kind of abstract scientific expertise, which I'm going to stylize this, but a scientific expertise is in principle placeless. Scientific expertise is supposed to apply to any situation anywhere in the universe, so long as the basic rules of physics apply, and it's abstract and it doesn't have to be situated in a particular place. And then there are other kinds of expertise which are very much rooted in place. And agriculture is a field where I think in order to problem solve and to innovate in those situations, ideally we should try to bring together these different kinds of knowledge in a mutually respectful and horizontal exchange. So you have the abstract, detached scientific knowledge of the people, with PhDs in white coats, and you have the situated local, contextual community knowledge of the people who actually have a stake in the outcome and who maybe understand all of the social and institutional context. And if we could get those people standing side by side, shoulder to shoulder, understanding the problem and designing a solution together in a co-constructed, co-designed way. Now, the problem with that is that it's expensive. If we imagined agricultural extension and research in a way where you could afford to have individual PhD qualified scientists standing alongside every farmer, that would be wonderful, but it's not for this world, unfortunately. So that's why I think the affordance concept is a way to sensitize the designers of technologies and also the implementers of programs to think about who their target is. And in my view, there are two legitimate approaches to this. One is you either have a very, very particular and careful and detailed understanding of your target audience. In other words, you're trying to help this particular community and you try to understand them as well as you possibly can. And you try to design your solution so that it really works for those people. The other option, which is the one that I emphasized in the presentation, is that you try to design your affordances in a way that they are as generous and inclusive and as open and flexible as they could possibly be, so that you can reach out to as many different kinds of people as possible, not just a very tiny niche. So I think I sort of found my way to an answer to that question. Thank you.
All right, so that wraps up our open forum. Thank you very much to our audience and of course to Dr. Glover for your responses. So now we proceed to you providing your reflections from this learning event. So if you have any questions or feedback from the presentation, kindly fill out the feedback form. Okay, we're going to give you a few minutes. And while you're doing that, would like to invite our Deputy Director for Administration, Associate Professor Joselito Florendo, the Department Chair of Science Communication, UPLB College of DevCom, Dr. Winifredo Dagli, to give the certificate of appreciation and token to our speaker, Dr. Dominic Glover.
First of all, I would like to welcome you all here. Thank you very much. SEARCA is fond of celebrating anniversaries. So we are celebrating our 58th anniversary. It was last month, but it will continue up to January. We're also celebrating our 20th anniversary of AJAD. It's a journal. So thank you very much for being with us on this very special month. And of course, we're celebrating Christmas. Dr. Glover, okay.
Thank you very much. Now we head to our brief synthesis of the discussion this afternoon and the closing remarks from Dr. Winifredo Dagli, Chair of the Department of Science Communication, UPLB College of DevCom.
Thank you very much, Sunny. All right, so I'll keep this brief. These are just some observations I made from the presentation of Dominic, and maybe some of my reflections as well on the presentation as well as on the responses. Okay, so first of all, I would like to touch on the value of technography, which is actually a form of ethnographic research or ethnographic understanding of a holistic process of a phenomenon, a social or cultural phenomenon. I think this is a very important approach for all of us here, not just researchers, but also project implementers, planners, policymakers. Most of the time, we don't actually exert effort to really understand what's happening on the ground, how our users, our beneficiaries, our partners in the community, in the field, are actually using the technology, or how they try to understand, grapple with the technology and its implication to their lives, how it's actually changing their social relations, their practices, or how their actual practices are changing their views about the technology. So ethnography in that sense is very useful in terms of understanding that complex dynamics. And of course, it's not just an academic exercise, because it can also aid us in broadening our understanding of, for example, metrics of success, how we try to understand adoption or technological change. I like technological change better than tech adoption for obvious reasons. So how do we really define the range of outcomes of technological change, right? So it may also help us to better understand, monitor, and measure or assess those outcomes. Okay, so that's my first point. The second point is about the importance of different knowledge systems. I think in so many ways, Dominic is also telling us that when we look at technological change in this way, we have a better appreciation of how science meets other knowledge systems, okay? There are many points of encounters between science and different knowledge systems. And I'm talking about the lived experiences, indigenous knowledge systems, and even, specialized knowledge of our policymakers, for instance, right? Practice-based knowledge. And so the question for us here, both academics and practitioners, is that how do we really incorporate this understanding of technological change through the lens of different knowledge systems when we develop technologies, right? Of course, we always say that we want to engage tech users, our beneficiaries, our partners in every stage of the technological change process. Meaning to say, not just in the promotional stage, not just in the implementation phase, but hopefully they're also part of co-designing technology and technological change process. But how do you exactly do that, right? So it's something for us to reflect on. And maybe the third would be something about that question about how do we create different forms of affordances that hopefully would allow for better outcomes, meaning to say more equitable, just, ecologically sustainable development outcomes. So what kinds of affordances do we want to see? And I think we need to also create new social relations or better social interpersonal relationships. And I think many people in this room and even in the online space would agree that social relationships, the kind of social relationship that we have with people would allow us to really navigate the uncertainties of that technological change process. Meaning to say, in terms of reducing obstacles, the barriers, translating problems into opportunities, for instance, amplifying or strengthening people's agency, building confidence, right? How do you build people's confidence? So you also foster trust, social trust within the process, within that process of encounter in the Pedro framework. So social relationship is really a key. And we call it here in Filipino, ugnayan. Anong klaseng mga ugnayan ang tutulong sa atin to create these kinds of affordances, okay? And then maybe lastly, something about dispositions and the Pedro framework. I really like that part of the framework, D for disposition, because it actually sets the tone for the propositions, for the encounters. And it also sends a strong signal for us to really understand people's dispositions. And so I'm happy that Dominic actually presented it in two ways. Like there's this more structural element to it, and then there's this more agentic component to it. And I think when we try to reflect on the agentic aspect of this position, we can think of ways in which we need to better understand people's, inner motivations, the affect side of things, and how those inner motivations would allow people to, to have a certain point of view or perspective about technology, and to have a certain way of behaving towards technology or technological change. We can also look at it from the perspective of propositions and encounters, like what are the kinds of propositions as well as encounters that would create certain forms of dispositions, right? So the point is, I think we can be more fully aware of the relationships between those three and its implications to responses. Yeah, so I guess that's how I would synthesize the conversations that we had. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sir Winnie, and to our audience as well. And speaking of the audience, would like to acknowledge one person here. Is he still here? Okay, we have Dr. Mauricio. Dr. Mauricio, sir, please stand. He is one of our avid supporters for ADSS. I think he attended almost all of the ADSS for the past 20 years. So we provided a token for him as well. So we just have a few announcements. Do we have them on? Okay, so we're gonna have a group photo, but just a few announcements. We have an ongoing call for the SEARCA Agri-Innovator Program. So let's see how the Pedro framework fits to this particular program. The deadline will be extended until 16 December. So if you're interested, you can visit our website for more details or scan the QR code. Another one is we have another ADSS happening Tuesday next week. We're featuring Dr. Eno Bars on pesticide-free cropping systems, game changer or slow seller. So please register through the QR code as well. Okay, so we won't be ending this without a group photo. So may we request everyone to please stand at the center of the hall. Over there. Just please stand and compress. We're gonna have a photo with Dr. Glover And we're also gonna flash our speakers, our reactors from PPSA, Mr. Vasily and Miss Erica. If you're still with us, kindly turn on your video so we can capture you in the group photo. Sir, please. All right, thank you very much everyone for coming. We have some light refreshments outside. Feel free to get some. Or if you want to interact with our resource speaker, also please feel free. Okay. Nandiyan na siya. Thank you, Monica, Erica, Vasily, for joining us. I'm gonna send you an email with the presentation of Dr. Dominic.